All right, I guess we're good to go. Hello, everybody. I just glanced up at my calendar. It's funny, I must not have glanced at it in a while because it's set on February. I think we're at the end of April, aren't we? So I'll have to go quickly look at March's picture and then flip it on over to April and enjoy that. In fact, I leave on a trip with my mom tomorrow, and by the time I get back, it's May. So I'm going to not get much time with March's picture and April's picture. I think I missed those 2 months.
Regina, it's
Whoop.
May.
It is May now? No, it's April, isn't it?
No,
It is
it's
May
1st.
Shoot. Well, then I missed both March and April already. I'll just have to look at those pictures. It's a really pretty calendar and flip on over to May. Isn't that funny? Thank you, Sina. So today is May 1, May Day. When I was a little girl, I used to always go pick wildflowers on May Day, put them on the porch, ring the doorbell for my mom and run and hide. That was my tradition on May Day. And then she'd come out there and make a big deal. Oh, who left these flowers? You know, she knew darn well who did, but it was fun. All right. So as some of you know, I have been creating slideshows to go with Rusta Burnham's Music of Christ and uploading it onto YouTube. I've now done 4 volumes. And I have the slideshow ready for volume 5. It's just a matter of sitting down for an hour and recording it. But, you know, Rest is real excited to kind of be joining with Awakening Together in this way. And she sent me a song the other day and said, do you think there's a place in Awakening Together for this song? And I said, sure. So what I'm going to do is play it now. The name of the song is Peace is a Flower.
Peace is a flower that blooms forever, fragrant with joy, blessing with its light. Peace is a flower growing in the garden of the mind that's aligned with the Christ. Ooh, 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 ooh. Peace is a river flowing on forever, arising from heaven. It's pure and deep and wide. Peace is a river, quietly it's flowing through the mind that's aligned with the Christ. Ooh, 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 Peace is a bright star, shimmering forever, radiant with joy and loveliness it guides. Peace is a bright star, shining with God's glory in the mind that's aligned with the Christ. Ooh, 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 ooh. singing with joy, sweet melodies of light. Peace is the music playing in the garden of the mind that's aligned with the Christ. Ooh, 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 ooh. Pieces are joining in what is one forever, recalling with joy our Creator and our life. Peace is anointing like dew upon the flower, the mind that's aligned with the Christ. Ooh, 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 ooh. Peace is a flower that blooms forever, fragrant with joy, blessing with its light. Peace is a flower growing in the garden of the mind that's aligned with the Christ.
So thank you, Resta, for the lovely song. I've had different spiritual aspirations. I know if you all listen to my teachings much, you've heard me talk about the importance of a spiritual purpose or a spiritual aspiration. And I've had different spiritual aspirations along the way that motivated me at the stage that I was in. But one of those spiritual aspirations along the way was to be able to genuinely be at peace no matter what was occurring. I knew people along the way who seemed to be on the spiritual path because they wanted health for the body. Or I remember someone who wanted other people to love her. They seemed to have these, what I would call getting goals, right? And whenever somebody would share with me that that's why they were on the spiritual path, there'd just be this feeling in me like that was off. And that's what led me to want to be at peace no matter what was occurring. And I would say that continues to be probably a goal, although it is mostly achieved. For the most part, I am at peace. And if I'm not at peace, if something should occur and I notice agitation of some type, I fall right back into those old practices that has brought me this far. So, some of those old practices are still used on occasion. So that was a nice song, Resta. Thank you. All right. So what we have been looking at then, I think for a couple of weeks now, is Dr. David Hawkins' map of consciousness. And I did clarify with you all that I'm not trying to teach Dr. David Hawkins' teachings, that I couldn't do that. I haven't read enough of him, studied enough of him. There's just no way I could do that. But I was just using his model as another way of communicating my own teachings. And so I want to just do a really quick review about where we've been. And then there's this one phase that I've skipped a couple times, and I said, we'll get back to that. I think maybe tonight we'll get back to that. So I'll share my screen again. All right. So this is Dr. David Hawkins' map of consciousness. for a moment. There we go. So one of the things that I've talked to you all about so far is, again, based on my experience, everything that Dr. David Hawkins calls below level 200 is what I call the lower ego. And I also mentioned to you that based on my experience, the lower ego was primarily purified or primarily let go, or you could even say the ideas in the mind that seem to be the cause of these lower energies were seen to be not true, were seen to be false. And so they were let go. So I mentioned to y'all there was actually a 4-year purification period where I was encouraged, and I primarily purified this lower ego. Now, one reason I say primarily is because if any of these things were to show up even here in the love area where I put myself now, as I mentioned a moment ago, I would go right back into the practices that I learned in the courage phase, and I would purify that energy as it arose. One thing that I've always found interesting about some people that I read or that I hear talk who seem to claim or seem to purport some type of level of enlightenment. One thing that I hear from some of these people is they'll say things like, well, I still get angry, or, you know, I still get whatever. And if you guys have heard, again, if you've listened to me for a long time, what you've heard me say is, I don't really understand that. And the reason I don't really understand that is not that I might not see a thought come up that I would call a thought of anger, right? A thought of anger could arise. And maybe for a moment, I could snap at someone, like a moment, you know, so a moment of blindness. But then I look at it, I notice it for what it is, I turn awareness to it, and it's seen for what it is. It's seen as unwanted, unnecessary, not real, not me. I mean, all that happens in an instant, and then it just dissolves. It just falls away. So this is what it's like, at least for me, at the level that I call the love phase, which Dr. David Hawkins calls the love phase, is at this level, things can still arise. I think Marisol asked a question about this. Things can still arise, but first of all, they're few and far between. I mean, you know, weeks and weeks can go without something like that arising. But when it does arise, it isn't believed. That's really the difference. It isn't believed. In order for me to get angry at someone and to hold that anger for any more than a second, I would have to believe it. I would have to identify with it. And I'm not even sure that's possible at this stage. I'm not going to say that it's not possible. What I'm going to say, because I think this is the truth of it, it is so unwanted, right? It is so unwanted that I just don't go there. So when people say they still get angry, you know, they still, you know, all of that, I really don't understand that, because to me, in order to get angry, I would have to fall all the way back into believing stuff that I let go of believing a long time ago. And, you know, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's just like going backwards. It just feels like going backwards, and it feels completely unnecessary and completely unwanted and way too painful. You know, why would you want to leave the peace that's like a flower in a river and all that stuff that Resta just sang about? Why would you want to leave that to go back to being angry? But what I do want to say is, after you finish the courage stage, and as you continue to move on up through the levels of consciousness, these things can still arise. And the closer you are to the courage stage, the more likely you are to believe them for a brief time. And the further you get from the courage stage, the less likely you are to believe them for a brief time. And then, as I mentioned, at the stage that I feel like I'm at now, when they arise, I just look at them and they're gone in a second, But from courage all the way up through love, there's still some level, you could say, of purifying going on. Because even though the majority of the lower ego was let go in the courage stage, little things show up every now. I call them little burps. Little things show up every now and then. And when they show up, you give them the same kind of attention that you gave in the courage stage in order to transcend them. And then you continue to purify them. In fact, in Dr. David Hawkins' description of the love stage, he says something like, one of the things that you're doing in this stage is continuing to let go of any little remnants that show up, right? Which proves that there are little remnants. One of the things that, again, that I found as I went through these different stages that I've gone through is that in the courage stage, the lower ego is primarily let go of, so that from the neutrality stage and on, there is a level of peace, a consistent level of peace that is a part of the experience, and a consistent level of contentment and happiness and detachment that is a part of the experience that wasn't a part of the experience prior to the courage stage. So there is a line here. He has a line between all the stages, but there's a definite line here between courage and neutrality where you've crossed over into some type of new territory, right? The experience is different after the courage stage than it was prior to the courage stage. But, and you could call yourself a more mature spiritual aspirant or spiritual seeker or spiritual devotee at this point. But level 600, which is really what I would call the first true level of enlightenment, is still a ways up. When you enter into neutrality, he calls that level 250. Level 600 is still quite a ways up from that. And so there's definitely still some work to do. And so as you go through the willingness stage, which I call service, as you go through the acceptance stage, I think that's a perfect name for it. And as you go through the love stage, what you are really doing is letting go of everything in you that is not 100% reflective of your truth. You're letting go of everything in you that is not 100% reflective of truth. And the primary thing that you are letting go of at this point is self-will, even higher and higher levels of self-will. And what I mean by higher and higher levels of self-will, the other experience of that would be subtler and subtler levels of self-will. But by higher, I mean they're not as selfish as self-will was in the lower ego. Self-will in the lower ego was about me. It was very selfish. Self-will in the higher ego can appear to be much less selfish. It's much more like thinking you know what's best for everyone, right? It's much less selfish. It can appear as caring about people. It can appear as wanting peace for everyone instead of just you, right? It appears unselfish, but there's still this wanting things to be different than they are. And that is self-will. So what's happening again in the willingness stage, the acceptance stage, and the love stage is letting go of more and more subtle levels of wanting things to be different than they are. Now, one stage that I've skipped again a couple of times, I'm going to talk about now, is this reason stage. And the reason I skipped reason is that is deep. And I looked very, very deeply at this stage in Dr. David Hawkins' work, trying to find myself there, and I couldn't. I felt like, since I had kind of gone from the lower ego through courage, through neutrality, through willingness, through acceptance, that I must have gone through reason in order to get to love. But no matter how hard I looked, and no matter how willing I was to put myself there, I couldn't. And I think the primary reason I couldn't put myself in reason is because reason is very attached to intellectual understanding over and above genuine experiencing of the spiritual path. And that's just not a phase I went through. For me, it's always been about the direct experience, whatever level I was at. So, for example, at the courage level, it wasn't about, I spent a lot of time with A Course in Miracles at the courage level, because A Course in Miracles is very helpful at that level. It was never for me about intellectually understanding A Course in Miracles. Not ever, ever, ever. It was always about contemplating A Course in Miracles and learning from A Course in Miracles what I needed to do, That's always what it was about, what I needed to do to let go of those lower level energies, those lower level ego energies. As I began to receive clarity about things like the 4 principles of God, it was never about intellectually understanding those levels. It was about understanding the levels well enough to know what I needed to do, right, in order to continue to move up through those different levels. So I couldn't place myself in the reason level, because this has just never been an intellectual journey for me. Something else that was interesting to me as I read, and again, I totally understand I don't know everything. So I put this out here as a clarifier for what I'm about to say. But it was very difficult for me to, at a heart level, even though at a heart level, I could agree with everything I read about these other levels. It was very difficult for me to agree at a heart level. In fact, it was impossible for me to agree at a heart level that reason was above acceptance, willingness, neutrality, and courage. It seemed misplaced. It seemed out of order. It seemed like intellectual understanding is meaningless. And so it just didn't belong quite so high as it was. What I want to do now is I want to share with you an article that my friend Liz wrote recently. I'm going to go to the Awakening Together website and share this article with you, because I think it's a perfect article to explain the error of intellectual understanding. So I put it on the website. It's underneath helpful resources, inspirational articles, right here, Liz Cronkite, Seeking Understanding or Avoiding Discomfort is what she titled this article. But I'm just going to read this to you. You can read along with me. She says, "It seems to me that in the past decade or so, due to the further proliferation of information on the internet through social media, many A Course in Miracles students," and you know, she's still more focused on A Course in Miracles, but I think this is true of lots of spiritual students, what she's about to say here. "Many A Course in Miracles students have become what I call non-duality generalists. They may or may not consider the Course their primary path, but having come to see the similarities in all non-dual teachings, they pursue, now here's the key word, non-dual ideas wherever they find them. And you're going to find as we move forward, this is the key to what she's talking about. She's not saying that you should stay with A Course in Miracles, and if you are going to other things, you're making a mistake. She's talking about the attraction to new ideas, attraction to ideas. So they pursue non-dual ideas wherever they find them. It can be helpful to read the same thing in different ways, especially when ideas are new to you. Sometimes what you cannot understand from one turn of phrase, you understand from another. Many don't realize that the Course itself says the same thing over and over until they have studied it for a while. What seemed a complicated teaching at first turns out to be very simple. But the Course is dense and difficult for many to understand. For new students, it can be helpful to read the same thing in different words and symbols and come back to the Course with eyes open. So again, she's not saying that you have to just stick with the Course. In fact, when I moved beyond the Course, I really never went back to it. But I still agree with everything she's saying here. So let's get on to her main point. And whether you study one teaching or many, eventually with understanding comes, this is the important part. Eventually with understanding comes fewer pleasurable aha moments. So again, whether you are studying one teaching or many, eventually with understanding comes fewer pleasurable aha moments. This is when some students begin to roam, not so much for further understanding and knowledge, but to have again the pleasurable sensation of the aha. New teachings and new teachers can be exciting. They and their approach are novel and refreshing, and they may say things that illuminate your mind delightfully. I hear things like, I used to follow teacher A, but they don't work for me so much anymore. Now I'm listening to teacher Q. I have come to hear of so many teachers from so many non-duality approaches that I wonder if many non-duality generalists are caught up seeking a sensation when instead they could simply sit quietly with spirit awareness. But there's the rub. Being quiet means being with the chatter of the mind and the uncomfortable feelings of a person. It means facing ego's resistance to spirit within, which is never pleasant. It means entering the long, hard slog of spiritual practice, the part without the excitement of the new and the pleasure of the aha moment. It is just these things that need to be seen and felt and allowed to pass to get to the awareness of ever-present peace. There's Resta's song again, of ever-present peace within you in spirit, which is so much more than aha moments. If you are continually seeking or moving onto the newest thing, check in with yourself. Are you moving toward deeper understanding or running from discomfort? Because in the end, the only teacher that will bring you the peace you seek is not in any teaching or human teacher, but past the discomfort within you. So it's interesting because what she is saying is that the spiritual path itself can be a distraction from the courage stage, from that stage of purifying the lower ego, because there is so much joy in the intellectual getting it, the intellectual understanding. That's what it seems like the reason stage to me. In fact, even Dr. David Hawkins says that the reason stage is a very difficult stage to transcend. It's very difficult because we become addicted to that new pleasure, that new aha. And again, when one teaching becomes boring because there's no more ahas, we have to move to a new teaching to try and start to feed that addiction again. I want to read something to you from NTI Revelation. This is NTI Revelation chapter 1, verses 12 to 16. All things within the world are the same. There is nothing special in any of it. Every experience can be used to lead to life, and that's with a capital L, so that means awakening. Every experience can be used to lead to life, and every experience can also lead to death, death being remaining ignorant, not knowing truth. Every experience can be used to lead to life, and every experience can also lead to death. This is the double-edged sword of the spiritual path. It may lead you to the life you seek, or it may lead you to stay busy as you work very hard, going nowhere. Only you can know what this path is for you. Now, the next paragraph uses the same term that Resta was using in her song, the Christ. Of course, the Christ is the right-minded wisdom, or the right-minded seeing from the second principle of God. That's often called Christ consciousness. So this says, the Christ within is your guide on this muddled and tricky path. By listening only to it shall you find your way. Listen to no other voice as you step carefully with me. Listen only for life, and be aware of temptations, which are but the appealing calls of death. You are not alone. You are never alone. You need but remember your true purpose, and all that you desire for discernment and guidance shall be given you. You will never be asked to take a single step alone, but you must always be willing to take the lead by deciding the purpose and calling it out to us. So it also reminds me once with Robert Adams. Somebody asked Robert Adams, they were aware of different gurus that might be called false teachers. Maybe what they wanted was power, or they wanted, sex with their followers, or wanted money. They weren't really interested in awakening. And this person did not want to be deceived by a false teacher. So this person asked Robert Adams, I always think this is rather ironic because there's Robert Adams right there, a true teacher. but this person asked Robert Adams, how can I make sure that, I'm not caught up in or deceived by, a false teacher? And Robert Adams' answer was, you have to be pure within yourself. If your purpose is pure, you will only be attracted to the pure. But if your purpose is not pure, you could be attracted to anything. So think about if your purpose is right now unconsciously, because this probably would not be conscious, it would be unconscious until maybe tonight while we're talking about it, if it is unconscious in you, maybe it will be revealed. But if your unconscious purpose is to get the thrill of the intellectual understanding. You're always seeking the profound. And if it's not profound, it's not exciting, right? If that's your purpose, then you may well be attracted to all kinds of things that are not pure. Because there are all kinds of teachings out there that are exciting, but they're just delays. They're part of this double-edged sword that NTI was talking about. It's the entertainment of the spiritual path rather than the true seeking. And you know what NTI says, and what Liz Cronkite was saying, and what I am also saying, is that the genuine spiritual path is letting go of everything in you that is not a reflection of the true self. I'll tell you what, that's a lot. But we could sum it up as self-will. But there's a lot of little pieces that make up self-will, right? Or we could sum it up as the person, or we could call it the ego. These are all the same thing, but there's a lot of little pieces to that. So the way that we live the genuine spiritual path is, first of all, by having a very clear, very pure, it must be self-motivating spiritual aspiration or spiritual purpose. The very first question to ask is, what do I really want from this? It's interesting because right now I'm going through my 7 Steps journal and editing it for publishing. And it's fun reading that book again after a few years, because what I notice is how much time in contemplation, some of that time in contemplation is practicing inquiry. Some of that time in contemplation is having insights, but a lot of that time in contemplation is talking myself into caring only about awakening. Isn't that a funny thing to do? I'm talking myself into it. That's what I'm doing in that journal. Talking myself into caring only about awakening. One of the things I read recently in the journal, I asked myself, I can't remember the exact words now, but it was something like, what is a life well lived? And what is a wasted life? And of course, I'm only asking myself. So the answers only matter for me and to me, right? But I'm looking inside myself to see what my true, not intellectual, but my true answers are to these questions. And a wasted life was one seeking pleasure. That was my genuine answer. I could see that, every pleasure has a beginning and an end. And then there has to be a new pleasure, and then a new pleasure, and then a new pleasure. And yet I could see at the same time that there's no rising in consciousness that's not happening. It's just seeking pleasure, seeking pleasure, seeking pleasure until you die, if you're lucky. Of course, you might just start not being able to seek pleasure quite so much because the body starts breaking down, and so it might end up suffering prior to death as a result of not being able to do those pleasure-seeking things anymore. But it goes nowhere. When I started the spiritual path, one of the feelings I had before I stopped and I asked, now what? And I was kind of guided onto the spiritual path. One of the feelings I had was that I was like a hamster in a wheel. At that point, chasing money, chasing success. And although I was pretty good at it, I was successful. I was getting promotions. I was getting more money. I lived in the town I wanted to live in. My daughter went to the school I wanted her to go to. Everything was, quote, good. Still, there was this knowing that I wasn't getting anywhere. Right? To the world, I was getting somewhere. Right? But I wasn't getting anywhere. And I just felt like this hamster in a wheel. Right? And that's what led me to ask, now what? I began seeking for something different. Well, it's the same thing. I could see that if you're just living a life of pleasure, You're just a hamster in a wheel. You're not going anywhere. You're not doing anything. And so I saw within myself that to me would be a wasted life. Literally, if I had the opportunity to lay on my deathbed and reflect back, and all I saw was all of these good times, which a lot of people would call a good life. Isn't that something? If all I saw were all these good times, that I would feel I wasted my life. I could see that. And so, what is a life well lived? That was the other question that had to be answered. That was a life that was constantly, genuinely seeking for truth realization. Even if the goal wasn't completely obtained. Isn't that funny? It wasn't a life well lived is one where you become enlightened. Although that would be great. I'm not putting that down. But the life well lived was the one moving in that direction, whether the goal was achieved or not. Isn't that interesting? The life well lived was just the rise in consciousness. So the next thing that I'll be bringing, and this is one reason why I'm showing Dr. David Hawkins' levels of consciousness, is because it shows that there is a rise in consciousness that one can experience. So the next thing I'll be bringing to you is something that I've taught to you a million times. Maybe, God willing, this will be the last time. We'll see what happens. I'm going to bring the code. And we're going to look at the code again, this time with Dr. David Hawkins' levels of consciousness. And we're going to look at how does one genuinely spend this lifetime rising in consciousness. Some of you all have watched some of these videos that I've recommended by what to me is a young man. He's really not young. I'm just getting old. But Leo Gura, right? From actualized.org. He has all kinds of videos. Some of them are helpful and some of them aren't. Some of them are partially helpful, but I've shared some of his videos that were at least partially helpful. And he has this one video, I think it's called Low Consciousness versus High Consciousness. And in that video, what he talks about is that the purpose of a human life is to rise in consciousness. That's the purpose of a human life. Now think about it. Ellie, she's this wonderful dog, but she doesn't have the self-awareness that a human has. She can't spend her life attempting to rise in consciousness. In fact, only a human has the brain and the self-awareness possible and the ability of choice possible to even attempt that. Therefore, it actually makes perfect sense. Imagine this: consciousness evolved into, or if you prefer the word created, consciousness evolved into human so that it could reawaken to itself. What do you think of that? Like, that is the purpose of a human life. Which is why, when I go within and I check, a life just spent in pleasure is wasted. If the purpose of this human life is to rise in consciousness, and if all I do is spend my life seeking pleasure and money and, whatever else I can, sex and whatever else I can seek, right? If that's all I do, but I don't rise in consciousness, it was wasted as compared to the purpose of why humans were created or why humans evolved. Bentinho once said that when you think about like traveling into, I can't remember his exact words. I can never remember anybody's exact words, but the idea was like you travel further and further into space to go to further and further frontiers, right? Once you've explored this far, you want to go further and further and further. Well, he was using that analogy. And he said the human itself is that furthest frontier, right? That's what we are, right? Form on this planet started as these little single-celled organisms. Think how far it has grown to arrive at this. So, again, Leo Gura was saying this is the purpose of a human life. And, Dr. David Hawkins talks about how the average person, and I think there's probably some people who don't even meet this standard, but the average person just accidentally moving through life and learning lessons, they rise in consciousness about 5 points. So if I peek back for a moment at his levels of consciousness, notice, for example, let's just pick fear. Fear starts at 100 and goes to 125. So let's just pretend that a baby is born at level 100, and accidentally gets to 105 in this lifetime. Well, then they're born right there in fear again in the next lifetime, and then accidentally another 5. And see how long it takes to move up through consciousness if it's just happening accidentally while we're busy trying to seek pleasure and avoid pain and whatever else humans do. But the spiritual student, he said, and by that he really meant the one who has embraced that our purpose is to rise in consciousness and makes that the purpose of one's life and does it consciously with this brain and this self-awareness that the human is born with. The spiritual student can rise, it's unlimited how far they can rise in one lifetime. They can have these gigantic, unexpected leaps in consciousness. He says that for the spiritual student who has the right support, such as a group like Awakening Together, but who has the right support, and I would add, and also has the pure motive, can easily get up to level 500 in a lifetime. He says that is completely possible to go that far. But again, like Liz Cronkite is saying in her article, you have to be careful that the purpose of the spiritual path for you isn't the ahas, the profound, the funness of understanding intellectually all of this stuff, because that's not what moves us. She says you have to make sure you aren't avoiding the pain. Why? Because we go through the darkness to the light. We go through the courage stage to purify that lower ego. And as I told you all, when I talked about my experience with the courage stage and my experience with every stage since then, it was a decision. I decided to use my life for this purpose. When I was in the courage stage, the purpose of my life was to purify the lower ego. I called it healing my mind. Now, the neutrality stage, the only purpose in the neutrality stage was to not fall backwards, is a good way of wording it. That's a good way of wording it, to stay with the level of peace that had been achieved, to stay there, to learn to be consistent there, right? And then the service stage was a huge stage of letting go of self-will. Everything was about, when I was in the service stage, if you knew me well and you talked to me, I said many times in that stage, I work for the universe. And I meant that literally. I meant every one of you, what I called Holy Spirit, mean, I worked for everyone. It kind of reminds me of when Jesus was talking about the apostles and James and John asked, can we sit at your right and sit at your left in heaven, right? And Jesus was like, whoa now. I mean, he didn't quite say it that way, but I'm sure that's what he felt. Whoa, whoa now. And he went on to explain that the greatest among us must also be the least, right? We must be the servant of everyone. That's what that willingness stage feels like, right? It's not about me, because the self-will is being let go. It's not about me. It's about everyone. And in fact, when Awakening Together, of course, Awakening Together was built during the service stage. That's what I was doing. And when Awakening Together was built, one of the things that we did was we created the minister preparation program. And we needed to define everything, because our guidance was to start a church. And when you start a church, you have to apply with the IRS to become a church. And that's a huge job. And you just got to define everything. There's nothing half-assed about it. So we had to define everything. And one of the things we had to define is, what is a minister to us, to Awakening Together? Do you know what we defined a minister as? Some of you guys are ministers. Do you even know what you're defined as? You took an oath to be this. A servant to the one true self. Do you remember taking that oath? That means a servant to everyone, right? So lots of people think of ministers as those who are better than in some way, like the minister knows more than everybody else, right? That's not what our ministers are. Our ministers were defined to really, it fits perfectly into that willingness stage. Our ministers are defined to be servants. That's their purpose. They find their service and they serve. And of course, it was easy for that definition to come from me at that time, because that's right where I was, right? That's the stage I was in. So I could feel that purpose from the inside out. Now, when I was in the acceptance stage, and I talked about this last week, when I was in the acceptance stage, I'm still serving. I mean, I'm still serving right now. Look at me. But the truth is, the whole purpose of my life shifted. It wasn't about service anymore. It was a bigger step into letting go of self-will. It was about any time I noticed that my self-will was here and somebody else's self-will was here, let them have it. Let go their way. Let go of my self-will and let them have it. It was about accepting everything, learning not to ask for anything to be different. If it feels like a hot, hot day and there's sweat dripping all over, it's just saying, oh my God, I wish it wasn't so hot. Moving into the heat, moving into the experience of being hot, moving into what does it feel like to be sweating. Learning to be okay with this. In this stage, if I smelt something, you know, like a person who smelled bad, or skunk smell or something, or poop, there's plenty of poop around here. Lots of people have horses in their backyards, manure. If I smelled something and the first idea was, I'd take a bigger whiff until I was in full acceptance without any resistance. Full acceptance of that smell. This is what the acceptance stage was. You see, it was a very deep journey into accepting everything. And one of the practices that was key for me then, of course, was the loving all method, right? The loving all method was the foremost practice during that stage. So again, no matter what stage you're in, it doesn't matter what stage you're in, no matter what stage you're in, the way to make a life useful, at least based on what I found when I went within, it looks like what Leo Gura found when he went within, it looks like what Dr. David Hawkins found when he went within, and Bernadette Roberts, I don't think I'm the only one. But what we find when we go within is what makes a life well lived is using all of that life, every experience, including the smell of poop, to rise in consciousness. That's the purpose. And that's the purpose of a human life. Therefore, a human life well lived does that. And again, it doesn't even matter if you get to what we call the finishing line, ding, 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 enlightenment. What matters is the journey. In fact, if you've seen a Peaceful Warrior, you remember where Dan Millman and Socrates went hiking, and Dan can't wait to get to the top of the mountain and see the view or whatever the heck the reward is going to be, the pleasurable reward from this hike. And remember, at one point, Socrates stopped and said, we're here. And they weren't anywhere special. And Dan Millman looks around and is like, where? Where are we? Where are we? And Socrates points down at a rock. It's not even a special rock. It's not unusually pretty. It's just a boring old little rock. Points down at a rock, and Dan says, don't tell me that's it. Don't tell me that's why we hiked up here. The point of the lesson was Dan was still seeking the pleasure, right? Where's the pleasure that I'm going to gain from this hike? And what Socrates was pointing out was it's the journey. It's the journey, right? The journey is the rise in consciousness. That's our purpose. That's what's satisfying. That's a life well lived. And one other thing that I found in my journal as I was reading it is where I was contemplating commitment. I don't remember the exact word. I don't think it was commitment, but I was contemplating, well, what is commitment to this purpose? And what I came to in my journal was it's not giving some time to this, like 3 hours a day. It's giving all time to this. That doesn't mean I sit in meditation all day, because I don't. Michael Langford did, but I don't. But it means that whatever I'm doing, the purpose of what I'm doing is rising in consciousness or awakening, right? I don't give some time. I give all time. It's the entire purpose of this lifetime. And of course, the code is what teaches us how to do that. So starting next week, once again, we're going to go into the code, okay? And that is all of the time that we have for tonight. So I will see you all next week. Bye.